Hello, welcome to the screencast where I will be introducing Heredity and Big Idea 3, transitioning from cellular energetics into things that cells do with that energy. Okay, so here is Big Idea 3 right here, that living systems store, retrieve, transmit, and respond to information essential to life processes. So the information that we are talking about goes by many different names, but this genetic information is also hereditary information. So if you're at the cocktail party and you overhear people talking about genetic information, hereditary information, they're talking about, of course, DNA molecules. Right? So this is the form that the information is stored in and is then transmitted, right, to other cells, other organisms. And so what I'm going to try to do is outline sort of the transition and outline sort of the big picture here for you, and get into some details at the same time, being able to describe and explain then this transition from cell energetics into Big Idea 3. Cell energetics, by the way, was Big Idea 2. Not that anybody's really paying attention to that, but also being able to describe and explain the purpose of reproduction, and then little similarities and differences between what reproduction and growth is, cell versus organism reproduction, asexual versus sexual reproduction, and then binary fission, mitosis, cytokinesis, and there's some other things in there too as well. So again, this is just sort of big picture. Okay, transitioning. This was what we've been working on basically for the first marking period, ending here in the beginning of the second marking period, was this conversion of energy and photosynthesis, respiration, right? And then generating this down here, ATP, for cellular work. Well, that ATP is used to do work, and that work can basically be divided down into doing these different things that cells do. One is cells reproducing, cells growing, cells and organisms maintaining homeostasis, and then communicating. Right? So we will be addressing the homeostasis and communication sort of in the third part of the show. But in this part of the show, meaning the year, we're going to be looking at this reproduction and the growth. All right, I want to focus on the growth part first, and then the second part here. So cells are using this ATP to do these things. Okay, growth. So if I come down off of that graphic organizer, right? So the growth one here is sort of three things for growth, right? So this is coming down off the growth one there. Basically, growing is adding more cells, right? More cells, organism getting larger, right, in size. So remember back when you were a zygote, right, here you are, one cell, and then you became 2 cells, and then you were 4 cells, and so on and so forth. And you were growing and then also developing, right? So when you were a seed, little embryo inside the seed, remember you imbibed some water down here, and then you started adding more cells and growing, right? So growing, adding more cells, getting larger, this is technically defined as growth. And then also development, this is the cells changing their function, right? So then you'd have like root cells, and you had stem cells, and you had leaf cells, and then soon, in this the flowering plant, you'd have flower cells, etc. Okay, so the development is the change in the function over time. So growth and development is one aspect of the growth. Other reasons why cells would be growing and dividing to maintain a large surface area to volume ratio. You don't have big, huge cells, right? You have individual little tiny cells here. And organisms then are many, many small cells. So that cell division, right, this takes energy to do that as well. Another aspect of growth here is repair, right, to damage. So when cells get damaged, there's a repair aspect to this, and that takes energy to make more to make more of those cells there, right? Repair damage, and also maintenance, which is a little more of the homeostasis aspect of this. Okay, so that's coming down from the growth, but then coming down from the reproduction line of that graphic organizer from the first slide. So here we'd have sort of coming down. This is the reproduction part there, right? There we go, reproduction of the organism, right? So this, you're familiar with this. You've been seeing animal reproduction for quite a while, where you have two different mating types here, male and female, right? You have meiosis, fertilization taking place, right? So this is a sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction in plants as well, right? So this is a cycle where this is the adult organism, and the adult means that it is able to reproduce. Right? So biologically speaking, adult is a loaded term here, meaning that it's able to reproduce. And so in this oak tree, these are the flowers, which is the reproductive organs of the oak tree. They are really small and not really attractive. There's lots and lots of little flowers on here. That's because that they are wind pollinated, and so they don't need to attract pollinators here. But lots of pollen coming off those in the spring, right? Pollen transfer to the female part of the flower, and then so you see these flowers on adults, right? And then from those flowers, those fertilized ova become then the seeds here, which in the oak tree is the acorn. Then those seeds are going to germinate, right, and then yield another adult. So this is the sexual reproductive life cycle here. Right? But there's sort of an asexual reproductive life cycle as well. In eukaryotes, this is an amoeba. Genus name gets italicized or underlined there. So amoeba, I don't know why it's not writing. It's the genus name. And this is a eukaryotic cell. You see roughly nucleus here and nucleus here. And then this cell, you just have the cells splitting from one another right here. Right? So eukaryotic reproduction, but then also prokaryotic reproduction asexually, just making more organisms. Right? This all takes energy. Right? So this is prokaryotic, and this is known as a binary fission. Right? So this all, of course, takes energy. So the difference, though, is that in the reproduction, let me just go back a slide a second. I forgot to make a point here, is that what I want to emphasize here in the reproduction aspect is that I can have cell reproduction and I can have reproduction of the organism. Right? And sometimes these two things are different, right? You're talking about the reproduction of the entire organism, like the plant, like the oak tree there, or you're talking about the reproduction of, say, a single-celled amoeba here. So sometimes the cell is the organism, right? If it's a unicellular single-celled organism there. Okay? So if you're talking about the cell reproduction, then you have either an asexual or a sexual life cycle. And then there's this sort of thing over here that's similar but not really related at all in terms of cell reproduction, and this has to do with viral reproduction and viruses reproducing, which is not technically cellular. Okay, so let's take a look then at that. So when we drop that down, we see that we're going to have asexual reproductions here. We have sexual reproductions here, and then this is reproduction of viruses, similar but different to these two. So let's look at this asexual reproduction over here. The basics of this means that there is no exchange of genetic information. right? There's no exchange of the genetic information, so you are essentially then cloning, right? Now, the two processes involved with this are for prokaryotes, again, the binary fission, and in eukaryotes, you have the cell cycle, which involves mitosis and cytokinesis. Right? These two things are different, right? And so again, this is in prokaryotes, this is in eukaryotes. In sexual reproduction, the definition here is that there is an exchange of genetic information, right? There's an exchange, there is a shuffling in analogy, terminology here. There's a shuffling of that genetic information, right? There's a recombination, right? Recombining genetic information from mating types. From mating types. And we are most familiar with mating types being males and females, but you may also just see them as mating type plus, mating type minus, mating type A, mating type B, etc. You could call them anything, but the point is that there are two different organisms involved here that are both going to contribute genetic information that will be recombined with one another, and which will be shuffled and get you new, unique varieties. Right? You get variation with the sexual reproductions. Over here, with the asexual reproductions, the cloning, there's no variation inherently in that, right? In those. Skip over here to the viral life cycles, and again, those are dotted over here. These viruses, not cells, but are parasitic in terms of using host cells to reproduce, right? Using the genetic material, using the genetic machinery, the cellular machinery of their host cells there to reproduce and make more viruses. So these have similar but different aspects to them, right? So all of this is requiring energy at some point, right? But the point is to get genetic information into the next generation, right? To store it, to retrieve it, to process it, right? And depending on who you are, you do that slightly differently, okay? Now, lastly, you said that asexual reproduction produces clones, and of course there are exceptions to those rules, and so these are sort of exceptions to the asexual reproduction in terms of them, not shuffling genetic information, right? And we'll learn about these in turn, but these things are transformation. So prokaryotes, right, will undergo transformation. This is conjugation, which is the closest thing that prokaryotes have to asexual reproduction. Conjugation, and then a transduction, right, using viruses here. So all of these three processes, and we'll talk about these a little bit more detail later, will increase genetic variation within cells or organisms. Right? So these are sort of the exceptions to, well, within asexual reproduction, right? So these three things are the link between the asexual and sexual life cycles there. And lastly, two other things that are going to help increase variation will be, so again, we're increasing variation, genetic variation is going to be mutation and transposition, where genetic material will be shuffled randomly, automatically, and quite frankly, in some of these cases, there is a lot that we still do not understand about this, and is a field rife for you to grow up and go into. Okay. Right. So let's just go back, and we were talking about the transition from sort of cell energetics, right? Using cell energy for reproduction, for growth, for homeostasis, and for communication. We're going to talk about these two later on. But within growth, we saw then sort of three things in the growth. In reproduction, we talked about reproduction from the cell standpoint and versus the organism standpoint. And we're talking about cell reproduction here. We talked about asexual, sexual, and then viral. And we talked about within this asexual reproduction how there was no exchange of that genetic information, binary fission, mitosis, cytokinesis, depending if you're a prokaryote or eukaryote. Right? The sexual life cycles we discussed, talking about keeping or generating genetic variation there. Right? And viruses, sort of similar to that. Right? The genetic variation, there is some link here between these things here in generating genetic variation. Here we talked about transformation, conjugation, and transduction, as well as then mutation and transposition. Okay. So this is sort of a mental model as to how we're going to be, transitioning here from the cell energetics into the purposes of reproduction, similarities and differences between reproduction, growth, cell organism reproduction, asexual, sexual, binary fission, mitosis, and cytokinesis. Again, all of these things require energy. This is a big deal in biology. If you are a living organism trying to get that genetic information into the next cell, into the next generation. And again, going back to where we started, big idea 3, living systems are storing. We're looking at how they store that genetic information, how they retrieve information, how they transmit that information, and how they're then going to respond to that information. Right? Thanks for listening. Hope that makes sense. If you're confused, please bring your questions to class.